Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast series focusing on critical business decisions. Brought to you by Brady Ware & Company. Brady Ware is a regional, full-service accounting and advisory firm that helps businesses and entrepreneurs make visions a reality.
Welcome to Decision Vision, a podcast giving you, the listener, clear vision to make great decisions. In each episode, we discuss the process of decision-making on a different topic from the business owner's or executive's perspective. We aren't necessarily telling you what to do, but we can put you in a position to make an informed decision on your own and understand when you might need help along the way. My name is Mike Blake, and I'm your host for today's program. I'm a director at Brady Ware & Company, a full-service accounting firm based in Dayton, Ohio, with offices in Dayton, Columbus, Ohio, Richmond, Indiana, and Alpharetta, Georgia, which is where we are recording today. Brady Ware is sponsoring this podcast. If you like this podcast, please subscribe in your favorite podcast aggregator, and please consider leaving a review of the podcast as well. So today we're talking about technology transfer offices and when it might make sense to partner up with one. And I think this is an interesting topic for a lot of reasons. One, I think this is an underutilized and underappreciated asset among companies in the tech sector broadly. And in some cases, you don't even need to necessarily be a technology company to benefit from these kinds of relationships. But also, not many people know this because the early part of my career is convoluted and would take a podcast episode to really explain in detail. But the bottom line is that my first job out of school full-time was to work for Brown University's Technology Transfer Office, which was called the Brown University Research Foundation. And until I had done that, I did not know what a technology transfer office was. So, why did they hire me? The reason was at the time they were doing a lot of stuff with Russian universities, and because I was a Russian speaker that was willing to work for peanuts, they saw me as a good fit. But I'm not a scientist by any stretch of the imagination. But that made a lasting impression upon me in terms of what a tremendous impact a technology transfer office and generally what private academic partnerships, and sometimes those are public academic, sometimes those are private academic partnerships, can do in terms of supporting the private sector and promoting economic and social development generally. So, if you are a technology related company and you feel like you may need help, or maybe there's some universities you think are working on some cool things, but you're wondering about how to take advantage of that. And most universities are looking very actively to partner with the private sector. That's a major priority for just about every university that I've spoken to over my career. I think this podcast will at least give you some understanding as to how to approach that conversation and do so in a way that's intelligent and productive. So, as is always the case, I can have a 5-minute conversation about any topic we put on, but we're going to introduce an expert. And today I'm delighted to introduce my friend Stephen Fleming, who is currently Vice President of Strategic Business Initiatives at the University of Arizona. And that's strange to say. He and I were just talking about this, and he's a native Atlanta guy going back, I think, 5 or 6 generations. And I think at least until 3 years ago, if you pricked him, he'd bleed gold and black. But now he's with the University of Arizona, which is ranked among the top 20 public research universities nationwide in areas such as the environment, optics, space sciences, biosciences, and Southwest border issues. They're among the best in the world. Stephen himself is a highly successful senior executive with leadership experience in startups, multinationals, private equity, and university-based economic development. Recognized as a thought leader for innovation and entrepreneurship, including selection as one of the first principal investigators funded by the National Science Foundation to help create the I-Corps program. Most recently, he led the economic development and entrepreneurship initiatives at the Georgia Institute of Technology. There's that gold and black I told you about. He's the former general partner of a $260 million early-stage venture capital firm responsible for 18 investments, 16 board seats, and 13 successful exits. I'm going to pause for that. 18 investments, 13 successful exits. That's a high batting average, folks. Previously led introduction of residential broadband products such as DSL, and cable modems. I remember DSL at Nortel Networks. Vice President of Product Management and Marketing at Lycom, which is a venture-funded startup, and started his career as a bench scientist at AT&T Bell Labs. He's an active angel investor, or at least he has been, community leader, and mentor to local entrepreneurs, and generally just a good egg. Stephen Fleming, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, Mike. I always hate listening to that intro because it seems like I can't keep a job, but I've had a lot of fun. It's been a great run so far.
I think the bigger issue is that they can't keep you. I didn't realize that you had 18 investments and 13 successful exits. How in the hell did the venture capital industry not keep you in there as a lifer?
Well, I tried retiring. It was my own choice, and it turns out I have zero retirement skills. And about the time that I was realizing that I don't golf and I don't fish and I don't do anything else you're supposed to do in retirement, Georgia Tech started sinking its hooks into me as a volunteer. I was an entrepreneur in residence at ATDC, which actually wound up running that. I got on a couple of advisory boards, and I just slowly got absorbed into the body of Georgia Tech and wound up running the group that I had there, which was actually about 200 people at the peak. I loved the venture business. I enjoyed it. It was the greatest job in the world. But honestly, I've been in academia now for, I have to do math, 17 years. And this is fun too. I love being part of a major public research university. It's a great gig.
So, what I like to do with most of these podcasts, and it certainly applies here, is I want to set a vocabulary for the listener, because the listener may not have heard the term technology transfer office. It doesn't necessarily come up every day. So can you describe for us and define what is meant by a university technology transfer office?
There's a general set of terms that would fit just about everybody. And then, many universities will have their own unique spin or their own unique interpretation. But in general, a research university is going to have faculty and staff and students working on research projects which may, in the result of that research, create intellectual property. And in this case, we're almost always talking about patents. There are other forms of intellectual property, as Mike well knows, but here we're going to talk mostly about patents. And if you are creating patentable technology, the law in the United States is that for the last 40 years, if that research was funded by the federal government, then the university has the option to assert title to that intellectual property. So the university can patent that in the university's name. Well, yay, that means the university owns a patent, which is a piece of paper, and that by itself is basically worthless. In order to make that have impact on society and to have economic value, that needs to be transferred to the private sector. And so technology transfer is just that. It's taking the intellectual property developed by the university and moving it into some sort of licensing agreement or some sort of arrangement with a private sector entity. That private sector could be an individual in the case of a consulting operation. It frequently is a startup company, which could be created around or adjacent to that intellectual property, or it could be a large company, a Microsoft or a Boeing or a Pfizer to license it and take it forward as part of a big company. But in all those cases, you're transferring the technology from the research university into a place where the private sector can pick up the ball, run with it, and hopefully create value and create positive impact on the community and on, as you try it, on the world.
So, sort of brass tacks, why does a university care about any of that? Right? We look at universities, we think about academics that sort of do their thing. Why do they take an interest in transitioning these technologies outside of the academic universe?
Well, let me first make clear why we don't do, or a reason we don't do it. We're not doing this to make money. A lot of people have that misconception that we're selling off this intellectual property, and we have a Scrooge McDuck money bin that we dive into and swim around in. That really isn't true. Most major research universities lose money on intellectual property and technology transfer. It's a cost of doing business. There are a number of reasons why we do it, none of which are financial. The one which people may not really accept this, but which is true, is that we feel it's our obligation. This is research which is being done, especially in public universities, but it's true as well at private universities like Emory or Stanford or MIT. We feel that creating this technology and letting it sit on a shelf and gather dust is not the honorable thing to do. There should be a path forward to make this happen, and if we can do that, and hopefully not lose too much money in the process, or ideally break even in the process, then we're fulfilling kind of a public duty. If you don't believe that is true, but if you don't believe it, there are some more tangible reasons. We, the university, tend not to make money on this, but the professors individually very well can. There are some professors out there, driving Ferraris based on technology transfer agreements with their university because of creations they've ushered through their laboratory. And so when we are competing for good faculty, and we're always competing for good faculty, the fact that we've got a supportive technology transfer office and all the community around that is one of the table stakes items to recruit and retain excellent faculty. So it's part of building our intellectual standing. And then finally, it's a great way to help out our students because even though I suspect those professors who drive Ferrari like those cars, most professors are not really driven by money. They would have probably made different career choices if they were. They're really driven by making their students successful. And by having these sort of technology transfer agreements and licensing offices and so forth, it's a way to give multiple paths forward to their students. If the student wants to start a company based on that work in the laboratory, or join a company based on the work in that laboratory, or if we want to license that technology to a big company and that student wants to go work for that big company, it's a way of helping the careers of those students that we spend so much of our time and effort in supporting.
So, that's interesting. With the exposure I've had to tech transfer offices, I've not heard it exactly in that way. So I've learned something. So that's good. At least one listener learned something. I think it's reasonable to put out there that universities are going to have a reputation for doing very so-called primary or basic research. Research that is fundamental to science, but may not have a short path or even a clear path to any kind of commercialization. Is that fair? And is that something the private sector has to then bridge, or are universities better at producing something closer to market-ready science than maybe generally believed?
The answer to almost any reasonably complex question is it depends. So the answer is it depends. In general, your instincts are right. We are working. If you look at the research and development continuum, universities are typically going to be big R, little d. We're working on the fundamental research, the fundamental science, and much less focused on how do you develop that into a product or service that you could put in a catalog and sell to somebody. We do some of that, but really our emphasis is on the earlier stages. And corporations or even startups are kind of the flip side of that. They are like, we have to believe the science works, but now how do we build a sales channel? How do we do pricing? How do we go through regulatory relief and things like that? So there is this. You can always hear people calling it various things, the valley of death or the chasm or what have you, that needs to be bridged between the early stage activity of the university and the later stage activity of the marketplace. Those are some of the ancillary functions that tend to get wrapped around a technology transfer office. But I'll also note that chasm between fundamental research and commercial deployment can vary dramatically based on the sector of science or technology that you're working in. If you're doing human pharmaceutical drug development, that gap can be decades. Okay.
Yep.
If you're doing software and augmented reality, that gap can be months. That can actually go very, very quickly. And other things, advanced materials or things like that will be somewhere in between. So just because it's early and fundamental doesn't mean that it's a long wait. It depends on the sector, and the closer you get to putting something in a pill that goes into the body, the longer it takes.
So, of course, we're talking about technology transfer offices, which are associated with academic institutions, and I think you would agree that academic institutions, culturally, structurally, fundamentally, are different animals than the typical corporate organism. And I guess so. Then my question is that should private companies have an amount of concern or trepidation in trying to cooperate with an academic institution, given that those cultures and sometimes the fundamental objectives are so foundationally different?
The cultures are different. There's no doubt about that. And the role of a good tech transfer office and commercialization office and other functions, a lot of times is to do impedance matching and to do, making sure that the expectations are aligned and appropriate for both parties. So the clock tends to tick slower in academia. The professor will look at something and say, gee, I can't get to that this semester. I can do that next semester. And the corporate partner, especially with the startup, says, I don't know what a semester is, but can I have something by Tuesday?
Right.
And those are just fundamentally different. So it's a matter of managing expectations. It's a matter of understanding that if you're looking for something that's going to go into production in your factory in the next 90 days, you probably are not going to get that out of the university. If you're looking for something which is going to completely obsolete what's in your factory right now and make you build a new factory, that very well may be coming from the university. And the earlier you get to start on that, the better. Now, given that, I will say a lot of the grief that universities get for being slow and stubborn and hard to deal with and so forth, a lot of that is anecdotal. Sometimes that's self-serving on the part of the non-university partner. A lot of universities, including the two that I've been closely involved with, Georgia Tech and now University of Arizona, have gotten a lot better at this in the last couple of decades. So if you're hearing horror stories about, back in the day, I had this, situation, blah, blah, blah. Well, find out when back in the day was, because, in the 1980s and even 1990s, universities were pretty bad at this. This whole area of practice of university technology transfer is only 40 years old. The whole idea of university tech transfer really only emerged with the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. And most universities didn't establish tech transfer offices until the late 80s or early 90s. So in the early days, we were pretty bad at this. Now we've gotten good at it. We have templates, we have guidelines, we have a lot of test cases with clear, crisp delineations of what we can and cannot do. And so I think it's much more efficient and much more, a much less painful process for a company to work with the university than it may have been even a decade ago.
And I imagine, too, one of the ways in which the offices have evolved is that they hire people, candidly like you, who have been in the business world and speak business. And in your case, you're bilingual. You speak both business and academia. And that's an important element.
Well, that's true. And people like me didn't exist 20 years ago because nobody had done both sides of it. So now universities will have people who can help out in intelligent ways. And also, we can make it really clear, hey, this is not our first rodeo. We've done licenses like this frequently. Here's the points which are negotiable and let's negotiate. And here's the points which just aren't. and we're not, we're a public university. There's things that are a matter of law that we can't change. And let me give you an example. One that, frequently comes up in negotiations with either startups or with big companies is around the issue of ownership of intellectual property. Well, under federal law, if we've asserted title to the intellectual property, we have to maintain that title in the name of the university. So basically, we cannot sell you our patent. Now, we can arrange through a licensing arrangement, we can arrange for you to have exclusive, worldwide, subdividable, sublicensable, non-recourse, non-fee control of that intellectual property, which for all intents and purposes is identical to ownership. Because if your focus is not only do you want to use it, you want to make sure that nobody else can use it, well, that's ownership. We can make that happen. We just can't sell you the patent. We can't transfer title, but we can give you all of the benefits of ownership. And for the companies who've done this before and understand that, we can actually reach an agreement very, very rapidly. If we're working with a first timer that hasn't been through this and has to get educated about, so we're going to hand you money and you're not going to hand us title to the IP. Why is that a good idea? We have to go through an educational process. Now, again, the good news is over the last, I won't say 40, but certainly 30 years, we've done this enough. We've gotten better at the educational process. But, 30 and 20 years ago, we weren't even good at that. And there were a lot of people that got kind of crossways and got upset about the way things were being handled. But we've gotten better at that.
So we've sort of danced around it, but I want to make sure we hit this very directly because it is central to the theme of the podcast. And that is, as you go out into the market and make your pitch to cooperate to the private sector, to cooperate with, University of Arizona, but I think tech offices, transfer offices generally, why should companies be thinking about that? Why is that something that's worth a company to invest in?
Well, even when I worked at Bell Laboratories back before divestiture, which most of your podcast listeners won't even know what I'm talking about, but there used to be this wonderful Emerald City called Bell Laboratories, which had some of the smartest people in the world working there. I had 3 Nobel Prize winners, working within, a mile of my office, at different buildings. Even then, most of the smart people in the world didn't work for my company. And that's even more true today. Most of the smart people don't work for you. And if you're in a business where your product or service is going to depend on having the best ideas and the best technology and the best science behind them, you're going to want to get those wherever you can. And sometimes that'll be from inside your own skunkworks operation in your own laboratories. Sometimes that will be from startup companies that you go off and acquire. Sometimes that will be from universities where you go off and make license arrangements for intellectual property. Sometimes that might be with national laboratories like Oak Ridge or Lawrence Livermore or something like that, which also have tech transfer offices. So, you as a company are going to be in search for the best ideas, the best science, the best technology, the best implementation, and you need to have processes in place to chase those ideas wherever they live. And if they happen to be at universities, you need to have processes and structures in place where you can easily incorporate those into your product and service planning without breaking your whole system.
Now that's a very interesting answer because I didn't expect it. I would have thought that the first answer that would have come is cost. Is that in your case, the taxpayers of the state of Arizona, and to a lesser extent, federal taxpayers, have funded research that's gotten it to a certain point, so you're able to piggyback on resources that have already been spent by somebody else. And maybe that's true, and I'll ask you to comment on that in a minute. But interestingly, it's the what you're really leading with is expanding your, in effect, network of intellectual capital, because you even as you said, Bell Labs can't house it all in one place.
Right, and to reply to your approach, you're not wrong. I mean, the taxpayer is paying, countrywide billions of dollars for this research, which, your company can't afford those billions of dollars. But the truth of the matter is, going for university tech transfer as a cost reduction strategy is probably misguided, because if you're, and I'm speaking from a big company's perspective right now, for a big company, your cost is basically all payroll. Everything else is a rounding error. I don't care how many electron microscopes you've got and whatever other pieces of test equipment you've got. Your cost is going to be the cost of people, and you're going to pay those people whether they're working on good ideas or whether they're working on bad ideas. So what you want to do is maximize the time they're working on good ideas. And if you can jumpstart them with a piece of intellectual property, or maybe you just hire a really great graduate student and there's no licensing arrangement that comes with it. You're just hiring a great grad student, and you're jumpstarting that very expensive payroll you've got to work on better ideas faster. That's how you go into the marketplace and compete and win. It's not because, we've got this wonderful, gas chromatograph that you're able to use for a cheap rate because the taxpayers paid for it. We're happy to do that, but that's not going to make you win.
So you touched upon something at the start of the interview, and I want to come back to that. Are there certain fields of science that lend themselves better to a technology transfer relationship than others?
The relationships can be different. I'd say pretty much, all of the, science and engineering related work that is done at a university, can all be transferred. Some will transfer faster than others. What I would say is that different ones lend themselves to different structures. And let's take the two extremes. Let's take drug development and let's take software. Software is very easily transferred to startup because you have essentially no capital requirements, a couple of laptops and an internet connection. You have, very few, perhaps too few regulatory requirements. So you can set up shop as a startup with a license to university intellectual property, very, very quickly, very, very cheaply. If you're working in drug development, there's an enormous amount of regulatory burden, perhaps too much. That's a different conversation. There's an enormous amount of capital requirements. There's an enormous amount of overhead required in creating and developing channels to market. It's a hugely expensive proposition, and it's very unusual that a startup company would be able to take that all the way to the marketplace. You might start with a startup company with the intention of having that startup company acquired, by a Pfizer or a GlaxoSmithKline or somebody like that later on. So I'd say that, all areas of technology have interesting leading edge work being done at universities. All of it can be transferred, but you wouldn't necessarily use the same cookie cutter template, depending on what business you're in.
Yeah. And interestingly that there's, you did cite two extremes, and those two, in spite of the fact those are extreme cases, the cases for that kind of collaboration is readily visible either way, right? If it is going to be a longer, more expensive process for pharmaceutical development, but that's just the way pharmaceutical development works, whether it's private or academic.
Right. And it's just the way that works. You're putting, substances in human bodies, and we as a culture have decided we're going to have certain rules about that. And following those rules takes a lot of time, money, and talent. That's not saying it's a bad thing. It's just saying that you need to know that, when you're starting a company in that sector or launching a product for a big company in that sector.
So we've touched upon one particular model, which is technology licensing, or what you've described sounds to me like effectively a sort of synthetic ownership transfer. Are there other models out there that that companies can consider, or does it have to be that kind of licensing model?
Well, there's different kinds of licenses, and the fundamental, dividing in two is exclusive and non-exclusive. And an exclusive license is, this is mine. One way or another, I paid for it, and I want to control it, and I want to make sure that nobody else can use it. And we're happy to create exclusive licenses like that. They cost a little bit of money. If that's not critical to you, and what you really want is freedom to operate, and just to make sure that no one else can come and say you have to stop doing what you're doing because now they have control or ownership of the piece of intellectual property, that can be a non-exclusive license. And so something that we grant all the time is called, the acronym is NERF, non-exclusive royalty-free license. And that's basically saying, we, the university, own this piece of intellectual property for various bits of compensation, which can vary depending on the deal. You've given us a good and sufficient reason that we're granting you a non-exclusive royalty-free license, which means you can use this in your product and service, and you don't have to pay us any additional for that because you've paid us something up front. But at the same time, you can't stop, brand X from using it, and you can't stop us from licensing it to brand X, Y, and Z under other arrangements. And that's actually of great utility, especially to some folks in the hardware-related businesses, because they're not looking to build the product around, this particular way of building semiconductors. They want to build those semiconductors to put them into a laptop and sell laptops. And that's really what they want to do. And so what they want is freedom to operate, to know that they're safe from getting, a tap on the shoulder or a nasty letter from a lawyer saying, you can't do that anymore. So there's a whole range of different arrangements. We at the University of Arizona have got a couple of templates called the Arizona Choice, which you can look up on the website if you want to. And those are kind of the two versions. Is if you really think you're going to want an exclusive, you can pay us up front, and we'll make sure that nobody else even gets a look at that technology. If you just want freedom to operate, you can pay us a little less, or actually a lot less. And you can have that. You can also be in between. You can say, look, I want a non-exclusive with a certain amount of period of time to decide if I want to negotiate an exclusive and pay more money. And we can make that happen. So, we can be pretty flexible within the bounds of, federal law and IRS regulations and things like that we can't change. Within those boundaries, because we're doing this as a service to our faculty and to our students and to the community, and we're not, trying to make money off this, we'll be as flexible as we can be. So
what you're describing to me is something that sounds to me of a highly transactional nature, which is, let's say, U of A has developed technology X, and company A thinks that technology X is pretty cool. Company A says, I'd like to have technology X. And then you work out some model that makes sense for you by which company A does have access to technology X. My question is this: are there other more expansive models out there? For example, purely hypothetical, right? But I'm going to use this example because I know this sector very well. Let's take Boeing, and they've had literally a disaster of a product launch, and they're still trying to figure out how to get that thing flying, right?
And not just on the 737 MAX. I mean, they've had troubles in a lot of places. They've had a bad year.
They have.
Go ahead.
For sure, right? And if I were they, and maybe they're already doing this, I don't know, but I would want to go to some. I would at least think about: is there something that we can partner with? Maybe there's some people, in spite of Boeing being Boeing and who they are and how many people there are, and lots of smart engineers and all that. But is there somebody that can just help us figure this darn thing out so we get the planes back flying again and people being willing to fly on them? Are there models where there's sort of in effect, I guess, a joint venture available where, that company may not have the answer. Maybe they don't think the university itself has the answer either, but probably has the resources to help them figure out the answer. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, and let's make sure to make very clear. I'm not talking specifically about Boeing, because by the time you get to the situation they're in, I mean they're in an issue where it's a public relations crisis. It's a stock price crisis. I mean, you don't want to get to that point,
right?
And we universities in general really are not in the fix it up business. We're not turnaround specialists. And because our clock does tick slower, if you're trying to figure out how to get your stock price back up in the next 90 days, we're not going to be the ones to solve that problem. But to answer the deeper question, are there other relationships? Yes, absolutely. What you can find is certain companies will look at certain universities with particular specialties and say, there's just a lot of great activity going on there. We're not looking to license any specific piece of intellectual property, which as you correctly noted, is transactional. We just want to be in the conversation with these folks to kind of figure out what's coming next and how that's going to affect our business. And, what should we be thinking about for 5 years out, not 90 days out, but 5 years out. And there we've got a couple of models. We, the universities in general, have a couple of models. One of which is just a bilateral agreement between the university and a big company to say, hey, let's come sponsor some research. Let's do some sabbaticals for your faculty. Let's do some internships for our grad students. Let's just have this free-flowing set of discussions between the two of us, so we can help color your perception of what you're working on next. And oh, by the way, these graduate students doing internships with you, you're going to want to hire them. And so we be a conveyor belt of talent to them. That would be kind of a bilateral research agreement. We can also do those as multilateral. And we can say, we're working on what could be seen as pre-competitive technology or non-competitive technology. And let's put together a consortium. And sometimes we'll do that purely with university partnership with companies. Sometimes we'll get federal dollars to help make that happen through a National Science Foundation grant or something like that. And this brings us up to one of the important roles of a major research university, especially a public research university, is we can act as a convener. And you'll never get Coke and Pepsi to cooperate, but you can get both Coke and Pepsi to join a university consortium to look at issues of, let's say, how I'm making this up. This is not a real project, but how could we minimize water use in making our soft drinks in areas where they're under water stress because of drought or because of climate change or what have you. That's not going to be a competitive advantage for Coke nor for Pepsi. They're not going to go advertise, hey, we're using less water in our production process. It would save them money. It would be a good thing for them, but it's not necessarily a head-to-head competitive issue. So that's one where you could see, and again, it's purely hypothetical, you could see both of those companies coming together and working with the university and saying, how are the best ways to do this? And by the way, here's some things we as Coke have tried, and here's some things we as Pepsi have tried, and the university is here's some things we as the university have tried, and let's start trying to find best of breed. And so that sort of research consortium is not focused on a license, is not focused on a transaction, but it's focused on moving the chains for everybody in the industry. And again, that's something which really can only be done at a major research university. There's really not other entities that are able to do that very well.
So we're running up against the clock here. Just time for a couple more questions. But one I want to make sure I get out there is, let's say a listener has become convinced that at least exploring a relationship with a tech transfer office is worthwhile. What are the first couple of steps to get started on that?
Well, the first is picking the right university. And there can be lots of reasons why it's right. The best one is that university is working on the technology that you specifically are interested in. You want to go find the leaders in that. The other might be, they're your neighbors down the street, and there's a certain value that you shouldn't discount the value of being able to be local to your local research university, because you may find out that they're not working on the particular widget you're interested in, but they've got people who could be. And if you were to sponsor research in that area, they could suddenly become a very strong leader in that area with just a little bit of nudge and a little bit of resource. But you need to have a thesis. You need to have a reason for why you're talking to a particular university or a particular set of universities, because there's 100 tier 1 universities in the country and hundreds more in the lower tiers. You can't talk to all of them. So first, you pick the ones you want to talk to. After that, I would have had different advice 20 years ago. But right now, in the year 2020 and thereafter, what I would say is, look up their technology transfer office online and call them or send them an email. And they'll have lots of different sorts of names: technology transfer office, technology licensing office, Office of Industry Engagement, I think was the name they landed on at Georgia Tech. Doesn't matter. You'll quickly be able to poke around the website and find out who owns the licensing process. Because these days, any substantial research university, and probably anyone that you're going to want to work with, they're going to have people whose job it is to talk to you. So they're waiting for that phone call, or that email. Because that's their job, is to do outreach. And so in the current environment, it's actually a very, very easy conversation to get started. You go to the webpage, you find the right link to click on or number to pick up the phone call, what have you, talk to those people, and they can start navigating you through the process as it exists at that university. Because the basics will be the same anywhere. But some of the specifics will be different depending on what university policy is, whether they're public or private, how they're structured, blah, blah, blah. There's lots of reasons. But those people in the tech transfer office can act as your native guide, through that process and make sure that it's successful for you.
So, Stephen, to wrap up, this is obviously a complex issue. And I'm sure there are going to be listeners that could very well have more questions. If they're interested in either collaborating with the University of Arizona or just tech transfer in general, would it be okay if they contacted you? And if so, what's the best way to do so?
Oh, absolutely. I'm happy to talk to any of your listeners. I'm easy to find. It's my first name, last name, Stephen Fleming at arizona.edu. And Google finds me easily. But also, make sure they do, talk to their local university if they've got questions, even if that's not the one they want to talk to. There also is a trade organization, AUTM, which used to stand for American University of Technology Managers, but then the non-Americans started joining, so now AUTM just stands for AUTM. And they have publications, they have conferences, and they welcome, they welcome non-university participants. So if you decide to get serious about this, go to an AUTM meeting, or they have them regionally, so it's not necessarily having to fly across the world to do it. You get a chance to meet a lot of people, hear about a lot of different models. It is because it is a transactional business, it only survives if there are transactions. Therefore, there are people who are motivated to make sure transactions happen. So you'll find that there's many, many people anxious to work with you if this is something that makes sense for your business.
Well, that's going to wrap it up for today's program. I'd like to thank Stephen Fleming so much for joining us and sharing his expertise with us. We'll be exploring a new topic each week, so please tune in so that when you're faced with your next executive decision, you have clear vision when making it. If you enjoy these podcasts, please consider leaving a review with your favorite podcast aggregator. It helps people find us so that we can help them. Once again, this is Mike Blake. Our sponsor is Brady Ware & Company, and this has been the Decision Vision Podcast.